highlights that the government can use to transform our country. I thank you for those, O Lord, who are in the background. We pray that, Lord, you will guide them. And we pray that those who will be present to listen into this webinar will be blessed. We surrender it to you and we thank you. In Jesus' name I've prayed. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much, Isaac. And once again, I see the numbers are growing. Welcome to our distinguished panel. You would have seen already that we have a very, very vibrant, very esteemed, very sought after panel. And so for us today at Castle, it is a privilege to welcome as our special guest, Dr. Ezra Suruma, which I will be giving the detailed bio later. I know for many of them, you don't need, actually for all of them, you don't need any intro, but I will be giving you the nuts and bolts of who they are. Mr. Godbert Mushabe, Dr. Sarah Sewanyana, and Dr. Joseph Muvawala. We had hoped to be joined by Mr. Moses Kagwa from the Ministry of Finance, Planning and Economic Development, but his schedule has changed at the last minute, but we will have some representation from the ministry and we will be able to hear their perspective and even ask them a few questions. So if you had prepared to have a conversation with MOFPED, please retain those talking points. Let me now share a few housekeeping points for all of us to know so that we can go through this seamlessly. So to begin with, I'm inviting all of us who are on social media to use the hashtag CastleWebinar, and today's special one is Thrive Think Tanks, because you know this is the Thrive webinar series. I also invite those who have not yet followed Castle Think Tank on Twitter and Facebook. Our handle is @castle_org on Twitter. Please do that. This is live on Facebook, so those who are on Facebook, please feel free to put your questions, if you have them, in the comment box, and we will be able to project them on this side to the panelists. Now, for purposes of the question and answer, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A tab. Please use that one and not the chat so that you can place your questions or comments. You can do this if you already have them or during the course of the discussion. We will be inviting the panelists to look into the chat and see if there are any questions that they want us to respond to, especially those that are directed to them. Lastly, we will have a poll question every 30 minutes to test to see where we all are on the matter of think tanks and national planning. It's a discussion that I believe we all have a contribution to make along, and we've seen from the COVID era that thinking has taken over the process of responding, either in the immediate aftermath or even planning for the medium and long term. So please prepare to answer those questions, those poll questions when they come in. Going back to the program, we are going to start with a presentation. What we do in these webinars is that as Castle, we would have undergone a thought process and produced a think piece, carrying our views, our understanding of the situation, and our recommendations to the authorities and to all stakeholders who are in the value chain of the discussion we are having, and today is no exception. Today we are privileged that our presenter of the topic is our leader, our board chairman, Dr. James Magara, and later I'll be inviting him to speak to us, and I will also introduce him. So just to say welcome. Today we are talking about think tanks and national planning. We're doing this because the world is responding to the immediate effects of COVID, and thinking about the medium and long-term imperatives that we will require as countries to help us meet our national goals, which have currently been disrupted, and see how we can remain on an even keel. The signals are strong that even if we get vaccines or treatment, which is the main effort right now, that the pandemic is still live, even if we get them tomorrow, in many ways, I think it's fair to say the world has changed forever. Now, part of this change is evident that there's a continuous search for innovative approaches to delivering products, services, and even policy interventions to help our countries build resilience, sustain livelihoods, and thrive. So we have to think on a different level from where we were last year, barely, last year around this time, I don't think anyone in the world thought we would be having the conversations we are having today. And today we put the question, what role do think tanks have to play in this period? Will their vibrancy take a hit because of the disruption, or will they be revitalized because there is an opportunity and indeed an obligation for them to participate given the circumstances? Will think tanks grow as intellectual research and execution partners to the thinking that goes into national planning that is evolving very fast precisely because of COVID? I'm assuming that you have your own questions to the state, the contribution of think tanks to national planning. And so, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. James Magara, who will be making the presentation on behalf of CASO Think Tank. Hopefully he will answer some of my questions and yours as well. But Dr. Magara is also our board chairman, and so I'll invite him to make some preliminary remarks just before he makes the presentation. But before he comes, let me introduce him to those who do not know him. Many know him as the gentleman that runs Jubilee Dental and is many times on our screens speaking about leadership and things like that. But let me give you who Dr. James Magara is. He is a futurist with a Doctor of Strategic Leadership from Regent University in the US. He holds a Master of Arts of Organizational Leadership and Management from Uganda Christian University in Mukono. He also holds a Master of Science in Dental Prosthetics from the University of Bristol, UK, and a Bachelor of Dental Surgery from Makerere University in Kampala, Uganda. He holds an Advanced Leadership Certificate from Haggai Institute in Hawaii in the US. He also holds the Oxid Executive Leadership Training Course Certificate offered by the Institute for National Transformation and Sandulos Africa's Leadership Training Certificate in Servant Leadership. Dr. Magara is a cherished voice on leadership in Uganda and beyond. He has spoken at leadership gatherings on 3 continents. His passion to see Africa's immense human capital put to use is evident in his well-researched and provocative book, Positioning Africa in the 21st Century, The Pivotal Role of Leadership and Think Tanks. This book is available in local bookshops and on Amazon, and I highly commend it to all of us. Dr. Magara has been actively involved in raising the standard of leadership and education in Uganda and across Africa by raising, developing, mentoring, and equipping other leaders. Besides running a successful dental practice, he serves as the International Deputy Director General of the Institute for National Transformation. He is part of the faculty that focuses on raising transformational leaders in Africa and among Africans in the diaspora. He was also involved in training and mentoring of the youth through the Uganda Youth Forum, where he served as board chairman for 12 years. He is currently the chairman, board of directors, Uganda Heart Institute, and chairman of the think tank Center for Advanced Strategic Leadership, CASO. Please welcome with me Dr. Magara to give some opening remarks on behalf of CASO, and then to delve straight into his presentation on think tanks and national planning. You're most welcome, Doctor.
Thank you very much, Christine, and a very, very warm welcome to our special guest, Dr. Ezra Suruma, and our very distinguished panel of discussants who will be introduced in detail as we go through this morning. We are very honored that you chose to spend your Saturday morning this way. We know you're all very busy people, and there's no weekend for your kind of people. So the fact that you decided to give us 3 hours of your time is something that we don't take for granted. Thank you so much. And we do hope that this engagement will just be the beginning of a lot more engagements in other fora as we move ahead. CASO is a very young think tank. It only began last year, but was built on a training program that has been running for about 11 years now. And we registered last year and had a conference towards the end of November. This year, when the pandemic struck, we decided to change our approach, the approach we had for the year, and decided to focus on looking for opportunities in a crisis. And as Christine already mentioned, we did have a workshop on the 25th of April that brought together about 160 of our members, and had a 6-hour meeting, which went into sectoral groups brainstorming. We then produced documents out of them. These documents are being reviewed. Some have been reviewed, some are being reviewed. And then we decided it was time to engage with the sector leaders, with the public, and see how we can contribute to making good the crisis that we are faced with. This is still a working document, the documents that we are working on. Eventually we'll be releasing policy briefs and things like that. So there's a lot of work going on behind the scenes. So thank you very much for being part of this morning, and the rest of you participants as well. Thank you for making the time. We look forward to interacting with you through the Q&A, and your ideas will be picked up as well. I'll now go to our presentation, which is giving on behalf of CASO, and that is on the whole question of think tanks. I've taken liberty to quote from my book, Positioning Africa for the 21st Century, The Pivotal Role of Leadership and Think Tanks. It's available at Aristoc and on Amazon, as you've already been informed. So I'll begin with the background. The pandemic was brought about an unprecedented global shutdown in peacetime. Usually this sort of shutdowns would happen during war, but this one has happened in peacetime. And it's none of us have experienced anything like this in our lifetime. Its multi-sectoral impact has left no sector untouched and has exposed the dangers of a silo approach to long-term planning. It has exposed gaps in almost all sectors, and many countries have been found wanting and ill-prepared to face the aftermath of the pandemic. This pandemic has reminded us of the importance of long-term planning and the importance of mitigating risk through a multi-sectoral approach to planning. Indeed, the countries that have so far fared best are those that were found with empirically based, agile and multi-sectoral planning frameworks. Our world has changed, and in the years ahead, we'll likely be referring to the pre and post-COVID era. Like in the last decade, you always talked about the pre and post-war period. This time is the pre and post-COVID era. It's an understatement to say that we are living in an age of uncertainty. So much has changed and so much is still changing. As a country, our journey on the road to fulfilling Vision 2040 has hit a major bump in the road. As we face an uncertain future, it's imperative that national planning encompasses the long-term changes that will need to be made and the measures that will continue to ensure that our society is both safe and functional. And that is even if vaccines are found or treatment protocols for this virus are developed, and the treatment may come before the vaccines. For our society to rebound and to develop resilience against subsequent waves of the pandemic or similar future shocks, it is necessary to develop a unified, future-focused and interdisciplinary approach to long-term planning, taking into account potential global risks. And this pandemic has shown us what can happen in another part of the world that really shakes the whole world. In this regard, think tanks have a major contribution to make. But what are think tanks? Though the term think tank is a relatively modern term, the concept has existed in various parts of the world for a long time. The modern day term think tank has its origins in the military. It was the name given to the secure places that American military and civilian experts met to strategize during World War II. After the war, in the post-war period, the term was applied to contract researchers who did work for the military. Later on in the 1960s, the term was expanded to describe experts who formulated policy recommendations. By the 1970s, the application of the term had expanded to include those engaged in political, economic, and social issues. So let's attempt to give a definition, because there is no single accepted definition of think tank. But I'll use the definition given by the think tank guru, and probably the most respected expert on think tanks around the world is Dr. James G. Magara of the Lauder Institute of the University of Pennsylvania. And this is how it defines it. And by the way, this institute produces an annual report on think tanks around the world. You can find it on the net. Public policy research analysis and engagement organizations that generate policy-oriented research, analysis, and advice on domestic and international issues, thereby enabling policymakers and the public to make informed decisions about public policy. A mouthful, but I think that definition captures it quite well. And we can see that think tanks aim at informing policy debates and ultimately influencing policy, but not only policy, also influencing decisions. They can also be used to legitimize government or party policies, political party policies. Think tanks also act as a space for debate, So a lot of what they do is not only research, but they also provide a space for exchange of ideas in what has been termed the marketplace of ideas. So think tanks are very effective, or most effective, when policymakers or decision makers are teachable and willing to listen, because unless their voice is heard, think tanks are of little use. And that's why it's important to bring these types of people together in a space where we can talk. They're ideas factories. They produce ideas. And as there's a common saying we say is ideas are the most powerful force in the world. And there's no question that ideas that have come out of think tanks have had a very profound influence on the world. If you think about the social front, it was the work of Thomas Clarkson's Society for the Abolition of Slave Trade in the 18th century that led to the abolition of the slave trade in Britain. This was a group of people who used to meet and strategize and think, and eventually it took many years, but they had the abolition of slave trade, and that impacted us here in Africa. Excuse me. In more recent times on the economic front, we've seen the spread of liberal economic theology, especially during the Reagan-Thatcher era. This was a result of the work of think tanks like the Adam Smith Institute in the UK or the Reason Foundation in the US. On the political front, African intellectuals who gathered mainly in Europe in the 1940s and 50s, through their meetings, which we'll also look at as think tanks, they conceived and later led the movements that resulted in the independence of modern African states. So they are powerful. Let's talk a little bit about the different types of think tanks. And again, there is no single prototype of what a think tank should be. However, most of them share the common goal of producing high quality research and analysis combined with engaging the public in some way. There's a very wide variation in what think tanks do and the extent to which they do it, depending on their host societies. But broadly, they can be defined as either government, which are state affiliated, or non-government, which are non-state affiliated or independent. A word about the government affiliated think tanks. We have in Uganda the National Planning Authority, which would fall in this category. And this can play a very key role in the development of countries, as has been shown in some Southeast Asian nations. In my book, I give a lot of examples from Southeast Asia. They have a role in working out a national vision and also in serving to elaborate and guide the implementation, the monitoring, and the evaluation of this vision. When they are not there, national policies are determined by the influence of lobby and special groups, political advantage, or the impulse of a leader or leaders who are just playing politics. Depending on the leadership style of both government and think tank leaders, government-funded think tanks may face a challenge of intellectual independence, because the saying goes, "He who pays the piper, who pays the piper chooses a tune." So sometimes that can be a challenge, but prudent governments ensure that government think tanks retain intellectual independence and provide unbiased information for good decision-making. About the non-government think tanks, the non-state think tanks or the independent think tanks, these are also sometimes referred to, as I said, independent think tanks. And there are four main models that have emerged, four main models. The first one are the academic think tanks. These are either, they can be affiliated with the universities or they could also be independent, but they often are housed in universities. They are typically non-partisan and they focus on public policy research. I'll have a word about this in our recommendations. Then you have the second group, that is the contract research think tanks. They are professional specialists. They are paid by government to give ideas on a particular area. They are paid on contract. Then you have the third group. These are the advocacy think tanks. These are distinguished by their goal-oriented work, and they want to effect change either for a client, a decision maker, or they could have issues. They could have issues like women issues or immigration or something like that. They are advocating for a certain line. And the fourth large category are the political party think tanks. These serve the interests of the political parties they represent, and I'll have a word about that a little later. Independent think tanks are important. They are just as important as the ones that are government or state, because they provide an alternative source of policy formulation to that of government. They provide government with the necessary check on policies that might otherwise pass without adequate scrutiny. And they play a complementary role to state think tanks. Countries like Malaysia, there are times when the government actually sponsored non-state think tanks because they valued the alternative opinions that were coming from those think tanks. Think tanks constitute a marketplace of ideas where politicians, bureaucrats, the public can go and shop for ideas, shop for research, for analysis. And therefore, they have the potential to change the way that policymakers and the public think about issues. They are very, very key in democracies. Now, I'll give a quick word about think tanks and universities, so that I'm laying this out so that we understand as we go into the discussion. Universities are storehouses of some of the best and most well-developed minds that a country has. I just think of the brain power in a place like Makerere. If we were to measure it, they're very well-educated people, some of the best minds in our country. Now, while both universities and think tanks deal with the merchandise of knowledge, there are differences. Universities on the whole seek to produce new knowledge for the sake of expanding the horizon of a field, while policy research actively aims to put practical information in the hands of opinion leaders who shape policy debates and decision makers who make the final choices. Now, unfortunately, many of our universities on the continent, but even I would say even in Uganda, they are really more like glorified secondary schools. There is no longer research. It's just a higher level of secondary school. And this has to change. It's a challenge that often you find the academics is that they know their subjects so well that they tend to share too much detail of what they know, or they fail to present it in a way that their audiences can easily understand. Most of us would have an experience if you went through school of someone who's very good at their subject and they get so carried away in what they're teaching while the class is going to sleep. And that's something that you often can find among academicians. Now, think tanks are not just content with producing good research. They want research used in shaping public policy and public thinking. So think tanks are like a bridge. They bridge between the academic and the policymaking communities, and they serve public interest by being independent voices that translate applied and basic research into a language that is understandable, that is reliable, and accessible for both the public and policymakers. And they also provide relevant materials for different audiences. They understand that good research is useless if it's not delivered to those who will use it in a way that they can understand it. I'll now take us to a picture of what's been happening around the world, the global picture. For most of the 20th century, think tanks were mainly found in the advanced industrial democracies of the West, in the US, in Canada, in Western Europe, in Japan, but they have now become a global phenomenon. I think the world has realized the importance of thinking. Ultimately, those who think will control those who don't. And I think this is a way the Western world has been able to control the rest of the world because they are way ahead in thinking. By the time you discuss something, they have seen 4 or 5 steps down the road. The rest of the world is catching up. China recently, about 5 years ago, the government paid to support 100 new think tanks because they now realize the importance of thinking. If we don't think, we shall be led by those who think. In the past 5 decades, think tanks have emerged as forefront leaders for policy formulation. More than 90% of all think tanks were created after 1951, and 58% were created in the last 20 years of the last century. In the wake of the end of the Cold War, hundreds of new think tanks were established in former communist countries. And so, as I said earlier, they present a broad spectrum of different sizes and different activities. The US still leads the world with the largest number of think tanks in any nation. American think tanks also dominate the top echelons of global think tanks and rankings, which is not too surprising considering that they are very well resourced. Coming down to Africa, the African continent has long been a center of knowledge generation. Many of the famed Greek philosophers like Socrates, Aristotle, Pythagoras, and so on spent many years studying in North Africa, which was at that time the educational center of the world. And North Africa also hosted the library of ancient library of Alexandria, which was the largest, the most significant of the ancient world. So there's been a history. There are ancient universities in Morocco, in Egypt, and so on. But in the modern times, think tanks began in the 1920s in South Africa, on the continent. And they remained uncommon in sub-Saharan Africa until the 1960s when African countries got independence. There's a 2020 report from the Lauder Institute from the University of Pennsylvania. Of the 220, the report of 220 of 8,248 think tanks globally, as per January this year, which were researched by this organization, only 7.4%, that's 612, were found in sub-Saharan Africa. And you see that sub-Saharan Africa is clearly underrepresented in this industry. In the past, we were a generator of knowledge. We've become a consumer of knowledge. And it's one of the reasons why the world is dominating us. One of the things that has to change is how much we put into think tanks. As far as Uganda goes, that report released by the think tank Civil Societies Program of that institute and the Lauder Institute in the University of Pennsylvania, the report indicates that Uganda has 32 think tanks, 32. I need to point out one of the things that came out in that report. The Advocates Coalition for Development and Environment, ACCORD, was for the 8th time ranked among the top 100 think tanks in the world. So accolades go to ACCORD for representing Uganda on that forum. But we need many more. We need a lot more thinking as we think about the future, and especially as we face the crisis we are facing right now. I'll now talk about the trends of long-term planning in Uganda. State-guided planning started in the dying years of the colonial administration in this country and continued in the post-colonial era. In the years 1961, 62, the first 5-year development plan for independent Uganda was launched. It was a 5-year plan. It went to 65, 66. It was followed by a second one, 66, 67 to 71, 72. And as you know, towards the tail end of that program, we had a coup. And that coup resulted in a development crisis in Uganda. But all over Africa, if you look at the 70s, especially 70s and 80s, there were coups all over the place. And so we went into a development crisis. Idi Amin's administration destroyed the economy, disorganized the industrial and other economic infrastructure. It triggered a spiral of economic mismanagement, and he declared an economic war. It was a war against the economy. I don't know if they understood what he was saying, but that's what really happened. And then we came to the 80s, which had the structural adjustment period. In the early 80s, the World Bank, because of the crisis that developed not only in Uganda, but many parts of Africa, the World Bank and the IMF they're known as the Bretton Woods institutions. They prescribed and imposed economic policies for developing countries. These were referred to as the structured adjustment programs. And then these were followed in the 1990s with the poverty reduction strategy papers period. This replaced the SAPs with the intention of reversing adverse effects on welfare and the social conditions which had resulted from the earlier decade. At this time, we had outsourced our thinking. Other people were telling us what to do. But something significant began to happen in the early 2000s, and that was the establishment of the National Planning Authority by the NPA Act of 2002. The authority was established with, among other things, as an aim to build the national capacity for visionary and long-term planning. Subsequently, in April 2013, the Vision 2040 was launched, and we are now looking at NDP3, the second, the third, and NDP3 is being looked at now. So what did COVID do? What did it expose? What was the impact of the pandemic? And I'll just list them. One of them is it exposed, not only here, but all over the world, it exposed the lack of preparedness for crisis. I think the most telling was the United States, which is very well resourced, but which was not prepared for the crisis. Fortunately for them, because of their a lot of resource, they were able to gather together, and they're still having issues. But all over the world, the lack of preparedness for crisis was glaringly exposed. Secondly, it exposed the nakedness of the silo approach to planning as a health issue, which was the pandemic, ended up affecting all sectors. There's no sector which has not been touched. I mean, all sectors. I don't have to go through this, you know it. And we now were forced to begin to manage things in a multi-sectoral way, but the planning in some places was not really multi-sectoral. It showed us how the world operates as a system. And this is very important when we think about planning, because you touch one area, it impacts another area. And this pandemic, it came through the health sector, but it impacted everything. So we've had to be forced to change the way of our thinking. And thirdly, it disrupted national plans all over the world. It's disrupted the budgets. Even the budget this year was not the normal budget. And fourthly, as a result of this, many countries ended up doing crisis management because there was no preparedness. But in the corporate world, you know, we know about preparing for disaster, mitigating risk. This is something that needs to be applied at a national level. I'll now come towards a close by focusing on our recommendations as a think tank. Some of these are already being done, but they need to be done a lot more. The first thing that I would like to bring out is the greater inclusion of the private sector in long-term planning. And we know this is already provided for, but it needs to happen a lot more. As government plans for the next 1 to 2 years before a vaccine or treatment are available, it's imperative that the private sector is closely engaged. The private sector handles the nuts and bolts of the various sectors and has the most upfront information. The need for our countries to develop our analytical research and advocacy capacity to advance development programs has never become more urgent. And drawing from the success of East Asia, it's good that we now have things like the National Planning Authority. But I also want to point out that we have citizens now who have trained to the highest levels in some of the best institutions in the world. However, very often there is no space for them to exercise their intellectual capabilities. And so there's more need for more deliberate effort to tap the vast intellectual capital that we have. Some of these are housed in the few think tanks we have. We need many more, which are much more focused in sectors so that policymakers, decision makers have information when they make decisions. As long as, you know, we've had a problem of dependency, and as long as that mindset is not dealt with, you know, we'll continue to be subservient to the West, and we'll look to the West for policy solutions. It's time we really began to think and look inward a lot more. We've been dependent across Africa on regarding knowledge production, appropriation, and dissemination. And this undermines our ability to maximize our democracy and development agenda. We still have a lot of policymakers who are completely versed in, you know, looking at our realities through foreign lenses. But as this generation of indigenous knowledge increases, we will be able to get over this hurdle. We have to use our intellectual resource that is available. If we are going to capture the momentum for growth and development, we need to align ourselves with priorities that promote the ultimate objective of economic growth and structural transformation. Then the second thing that would like to recommend us to is scenario planning. It is now, scenario planning has taken quite center stage in the corporate world. And we have had an experience now. We've had reacted to the pandemic. We need to use as a country the crisis posed by the pandemic as an opportunity to reflect on the ability to navigate a crisis. And going forward, consider actions that will increase our speed, agility, and our resilience. So government must act imperatively in developing and implementing enhanced risk management policies. What if this thing plays out for the next 3 years? What are we going to do? Are we just waiting? What if, this is what scenario planning does. You create simulations, you view the bigger picture. You don't just predict, you don't just wait. You're not sitting ducks waiting for something to run over us. We need to sit down and think and plan and say, what if there's a war? There were recently drums of war between China and India. We've now known what the disruption of the supply chain can do. What if there's a war between those two countries? What would happen? Think tanks and other groups can sit together and plan and say, we now know what will happen if there's a lockdown. What do we do? So that we are not just reacting. And the third one is the...
You have 5 minutes to go.
Thank you. I'll be done in that time. For the public sector, think tank capacity as part of government machinery is crucial in enabling countries to develop national vision, policies, and strategy, as well as support them. So a robust, intellectually independent, and well-resourced official think tank is necessary. We do have the National Planning Authority now, but this needs to spread out. So that is not just one center. A number of ministries have planning desks. Perhaps that needs to be grown some more. So there is a lot of thinking that goes on as plans are being made. And it is useful to have a central state think tank, but it's also very beneficial to have other think tanks that feed and interact with that central think tank. So that interchange, so long as it's done in an atmosphere of mutual respect, we'll end up with the best decisions, and the policies the best policies will ultimately emerge. And this will then lead to us being able to train people that will help us avoid our overdependence on foreigners and foreign institutions. The fourth thing is universities. As already stated, universities are repositories of some of the best and most well-developed minds that a nation has. And every university needs to have a think tank. If you're doing research, how is that research going into the community? A think tank would help because it gives you outside focus. It's not just inward focus, so get PhDs and so on. But there must be a focus in which the content that comes out of our universities is filtered and taken out into the public arena, and enables things to happen with policies, but also implemented in industries and things like that. The fifth one is political parties. Now, I don't know about you, but I personally think the level of debates, national debates and discussions on strategic issues is becoming deplorable. It's declining. Currently, in the public space, it's not unusual to hear a discussion of development problems with very little thought and analysis. Everyone is an expert on how the country should run. The views of the expert and the man on the street are sometimes the same. There's lack of research. There's no scenario building. So you end up with very shallow analysis and solutions that often worsen the situation. And though we do have a growth in multi-party politics, few political parties appear to draw on research to enhance their function as a policy platform. It's research that enhances legislative debate. And because many political parties are cash-strapped, they don't have access to research information. So what results is just bad commentaries on government. That's how they get popular, to influence the electorate. And most of our political parties have little intellectual support. And therefore, they lack capacity for serious debate and analysis of scenarios that we so desperately need now. The alternative to debate is rhetoric and sloganeering. We've done this for 60 years. It hasn't done so much for us. Or shouting. Shouting has become so common in politics. And so, can't you make your point without shouting? So we hear politicians shouting at the top of their voices, and the others are shouting back or engaging in theatrics. There's an idea that says empty teams make the loudest noise. This needs to change. And without a knowledge-based exchange of ideas, the best decisions will not come. And so we end up with costly policy failures, and we waste our resources. Think tanks can contribute to improving this area. Number 6 is the involvement of the private sector in the think tanks in evaluating government performance. And this can be controversial because often governments don't want to be examined by outsiders. But we all know from the corporate world that if you open yourself up to scrutiny, you end up doing better. So this is something that can also be looked at. And I know there are some fora where this is happening, but perhaps needs to happen a lot more. And the final recommendation has to do with mentoring students. We need to teach our young people how to debate in a respectful way. And think tanks and other stakeholders should look at this seriously. Projects to teach the next generation how to reason and respectfully debate from an early age. The kind of behavior we're seeing commonplace in our public leadership spaces is really a reflection of the grooming that is happening in the education institutions. I come to a conclusion now. The crisis posed by the pandemic provides an opportunity to pause and reflect on how we are preparing for a future with close to 100 million Ugandans by 2050. It's not like we don't see it coming. It is coming. Everything is pointing to it. We have the opportunity to prepare and ride the wave to our preferred future. If we don't, we'll see ourselves turned over and over by subsequent waves that will hit our world, be they pandemics, wars, or other kinds of disasters. And this doesn't have to happen. We can see from East Asia that with focused leadership, deep thinking, evidence-based policymaking, and purposeful planning, unbelievable things are possible. We can draw comfort from the fact that parts of the world that are far less naturally endowed than us have been able to socially and economically transform within one generation. And one can only imagine what will happen when we finally get our intellectual capabilities applied to the maximum. So I would refer you to my book as I conclude. It's available and it addresses the topic of think tanks in depth. And thank you very much for your attention. Over to you, moderator.
Thank you very much, Dr. Magara. That was indeed an impassioned presentation on think tanks. And I think we can all relate somewhere with where we ourselves stand on the question of thinking. I mean, we are all on WhatsApp and some forum in which we are critiquing, criticizing, offering a view. And I think we haven't yet quite got to the vehicle of how do we harness this. How do these ideas contest, meet, participate? We know them very well in terms of how they do it in the political arena. Many times we have discussions here and there, but from what Dr. Magara has described, there has to be a mechanism for harnessing a country's best thinking. If countries are funding private think tanks because they are looking for alternative views, what is it? What lesson is that giving us? And if these are the countries that the most industrialized, that have the highest per capita and so on, and all the things we aspire to. So thank you. Those are some powerful recommendations. And I particularly I am interested in the question of collaborative thinking, private, public, and all those. It's a very good thing that is somebody who's not just involved in a vibrant think tank here in Uganda. I guess we know Mr. Tumshabe for public intellectual discourse, but also for the work of Accord. And he'll be sharing with us how Accord gets to contest the picture given about the think tanks in Africa is that we seem to still have a lot of work to do. So how Accord becomes one of the best think tanks on the continent is something I would be very interested to hear. We will ask you to start with a response and a critique of the paper and then share your own thoughts. I'll be introducing Mr. Godber Tumshabe just after our poll question, and I'm going to ask the technical team to please get that ready. And as they do that, let me invite the audience. Where you have questions, please go to at the bottom of your screen, there is a tab Q&A. Place your questions. If they are specifically directed, say so. If you are just putting a comment or addressing it to whichever panelist wants to answer the question, that's also fine. So let's have our first poll question. Our technical team, please put it up. And panelists, you don't have voting rights. You are election observers on this occasion. Allow me to recognize, as we wait for the poll question, Professor Vincent Anikbogu. He is a member of the advisory council of the Castle think tank. Professor Anikbogu is a distinguished professor of chemistry and leadership trainer all the way in Lagos, Nigeria. Technical team, are you ready? Okay, I will start with the introduction of our next speaker as the technical people place that question, just so that we can save the time. So Mr. Godber Tumshabe is currently an associate director at the Great Lakes Institute for Strategic Studies. He is also chairman and chief executive officer of Technology Frontiers Education Center. His current research interests include democracy and rule of law, strategic minerals and land governance, climate change, agriculture governance, and food security. Mr. Tumshabe's work career started in 1997 when he joined the Nairobi-based public policy think tank, the African Center for Technology Studies, ACTS. At ACTS, he directed Africa-wide policy research programs on environmental governance, biodiversity, and land governance. He returned to Uganda in 2000 as founding executive director of the Advocates Coalition for Development and Environment, a position he held until he retired in December 2013. So I shall update my earlier comment to say he was previously and not currently engaged with ACCORD. During his 14 years as executive director, he oversaw the growth of ACCORD into a dynamic and reputable independent public policy research and advocacy think tank in Eastern Africa, and designed innovative flagship policy research and advocacy programs. He obtained his first degree in law from Makerere University in 1993, did the postgraduate bar course at the Law Development Center, and he joined the Faculty of Law, where he obtained a master's degree in 96. In 2007, Mr. Tumshabe joined the Stanford program in legal studies, international legal studies, where he was awarded a Master of Juridical Science degree of Stanford University. In 2008, he attended the Stanford Graduate School of Business Summer Institute in Business Entrepreneurship. So I will be calling Mr. Tumshabe on shortly, but let us first attend to the poll question if the technical team has it. If not, I think we shall just proceed. And so it's now my pleasure to invite you, Mr. Tumshabe, to give your pitch, give your response to the think piece, and then you can proceed with any other thing you would like to share with us. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much, Christine. And thank you, James, for that elaborate and very comprehensive presentation. Very well researched and informative. And I think this is really a very good place to have this conversation. Just before I start, to say that, as Christine and James said, ACCORD is one of the recognized leading policy think tanks in this country. Just to mention that in the late 1990s, when I started my work career, I went and started working in Kenya, in Nairobi. And as I did my international travels, I was quite intrigued to interact with a number of institutions, think tanks, especially in the US and Europe. Majorly, I did work with the institutions like the World Resources Institute, the Brookings Institute, and then got interested in reading about institutions like Woodrow Wilson, Council on Foreign Relations. So I was quite intrigued. Then I started asking myself, I said, where are Africa's think tanks? And you could hardly, at that time, at the end of the 1990s, you could hardly find any of these think tanks. A few organizations are beginning to emerge. At the beginning of 2000, the number of institutions, ISIS, in South Africa and a couple of others started around that time. And you realize that today, this program at University of Pennsylvania that James referred to, these institutes are actually considered among the best in the world and topmost in Africa. So you realize that, as James said, really, we are very, very behind in terms of knowledge generation in this country and on this continent. Of course, being exposed to that experience, then I said, I am going to leave Nairobi and come to Uganda and start one of the leading policy think tanks on this continent. So that was my dream of, starting a code, grow it into a powerful policy think tank, which in a measure we did achieve as we grew and almost defined the policy agenda in this country. We worked quite closely with a number of government agencies. We were involved in considerable agenda setting in the areas of agriculture, environment, science and technology, the economy, and of course, as at the end, towards around 2010, I thought that my ambition was almost conflicting with my colleagues, because I had the ambition of growing this organization that bigger, but sometimes Africans we get satisfied with little that we do, and therefore I decided to of me and Accord. I think that I should remark that one of the major issues that I realized every small organization started, some of them grew, and then when the founding leaders left, they all literally collapsed or simply went in stagnation. So one of my major preoccupations as I planned to leave was, how do I leave Accord? It continues, and I think in some measure continues to grow as I had envisaged. But just about three or four major comments that I would want to make in response to them. While James has made this important industry, because think tanks operate in a business that I prefer calling the knowledge generating industry. So in other words, think tanks must be engaged in knowledge generation. While that is the case, the challenge we face today as a continent is that knowledge generation and knowledge utilization are different. Deal with that issue as robustly, as openly as possible. My personal experience is that independent knowledge and ideas are best consumed in democracies, in progressive countries. When countries become more dictatorial, when democracy is fledgling, governments fear taking on independent knowledge ideas. They like working with institutions that are able to conform and are able to work with the government. So in quite a number of cases, you find institutions have to toe a certain line to be able to be listened to by governments. Because if you become very critical, then the government's agencies, either they basically exclude you from the process, or even when the technical people, the policy people are interested in engaging and utilizing that knowledge, they actually fear the response from the political actors. And that cuts across a number of countries that I have worked in, whether it's here in Uganda. I saw this in Kenya very, very clearly during the dying years of the Moi dictatorship. And that's the time when I was working at ACTS, that we had a very, very robust knowledge generation program, and we used to work with a number of government agencies, but you could realize that the politics would stand in the way of knowledge utilization because the government system is not configured to absorb that knowledge. The second point that I would want to raise is the question about National Planning Authority, James. I was quite curious that you classified National Planning Authority as a think tank. My understanding of think tanks is that these are actually knowledge generating entities, and the consumers of that knowledge are mainly agencies in government and international organizations that are vested with the mandate to be able to take action and make progress on public policy. So I would probably want to say that I wouldn't consider the National Planning Authority a think tank, because the National Planning Authority and Ministry of Finance, and it's perfectly fine to have those institutions with their in-house research agencies. But those in-house research agencies or research departments are not, I wouldn't characterize them as think tanks, because if you are a research department of Ministry of Finance or National Planning Authority, you are not only doing research, you are supposed to do research and take action because you are a policy maker, you are in a policy making position. So that's why in framing this conversation, and in fact, in trying to determine whether a government like the government of Uganda is using or is interested in promoting this knowledge generation industry, we need to see National Planning Authority, for example, should be having a budget that it is able to outsource independent think tanks, whether they are purely independent or whether they are affiliated to universities and other institutions. We should see government and they are able to take up that, and of course, governments normally also have the liberty not to even use that knowledge. But I think a government that is committed to harness independent knowledge and idea for it, because that's my next point. But secondly, use that funding to be able to outsource agencies or entities that can be able to generate knowledge. So my third point is about the funding for think tanks. And again, having worked in this area, and having worked with the code and now work at a think tank Greece, you realize that the funding for think tanks in this country and most of Africa comes from the United States and some extent Europe. And I can tell you that in my work over the last 20 years, I have struggled to be able to maintain a certain level of independence of these organizations, given the sources of funding. I personally, I know, out of experience, I have learned how to deal with some of these donors and how to be able to secure your space for you to be able to do independent research, even when you have been funded by another. So in other words, for think tanks like GLISA and others, you have to choose, where do you get your money from? If you get your money from these funders, how do you secure your independence to be able to define your research and your policy research agenda? Are you going to run the agenda of the funder, or actually you can create the flexibility to be able to develop and run your policy research agenda? And I can tell you that my experience has taught me that it is possible in two ways. One, by determining where you get your money from, so that you don't have to pick any money that comes your way. And secondly, by building reserves that act as insurance for the organization, so that if a donor comes, if I go to a donor to ask for funding for a particular program and the donor proves stubborn, then I say, no, I can't take your money because that will compromise our independence.
You have 3 minutes.
And thirdly, yes,
3 minutes.
And the third, yeah. So the third point that I would really make is, which I found intriguing in James's presentation, which I think needs to be interrogated further, is that transition that he mentioned. I think it's a very important historical point that Africa, and then almost it has made largely become a knowledge consumer. I think it would be intriguing if James could interrogate that point further to be able to be able to share what inspired that transition from knowledge generation to knowledge consumption. How does this transition manifest itself? And therefore, what are those indicators that show that Africa is getting back into the knowledge generating industry? Because I think that the future of this continent will, in my view, will depend on two major things, whether we, because this is a very rich continent with immense resources, both physical and human. But I think the future of this continent will depend on two major resources, whether we can get back into knowledge generation and be players and be producers of knowledge and not just consumers. And secondly, whether we can learn to respect and keep time. So I'll stop there for the time being.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Godba. We have had a lot from you. It will be interesting to hear what Dr. Muvala has to say as to whether National Planning Authority can be referred to as a think tank. And thank you also for answering one of the questions that is key in the chat. People are asking about the funding, and you've told us there is a way. So I guess that is hope for other think tanks. There are other questions I request you to go and look at. It's getting very interesting. And let me at this point invite our third panelists so that then we can have the panelists address all the questions in one go, even those that they may not have found time to deal with in the chat. Technical group, did you want us to do the poll? Are you ready for it? Okay, in the meantime, I shall introduce our next speaker, and that is Dr. Sarah Sewanyana of the Economic Policy Research Center. Dr. Sarah Sewanyana is the Executive Director of the EPRC, the Economic Policy Research Center. She joined the EPRC in March 2003 as a Senior Research Fellow and later was appointed a Principal Research Fellow in 2008. In 2009, she was appointed the Executive Director of the EPRC. She has steered the center to recognition as a globally renowned policy think tank. She currently serves as a member of the Uganda National Panel Steering Committee of the Presidential Economic Council, the expanded board of the National Planning Authority, and Uwezo National Advisory Committee, among others. Sarah is a well-grounded researcher with extensive experience in policy-oriented economic research. She has extensively researched on poverty, food security, health, education, and social service delivery, among others. She has several peer-reviewed publications and working papers in the above research areas. She holds a PhD in agriculture economics from the University of Sydney, Australia, a Master's of Science in agriculture economics from the University of Manitoba, Canada, and a Bachelor of Statistics from Makerere University. Dr. Sarah Sewanyana, it is my singular pleasure to invite you to give a response to the paper presented by Dr. Magara and also to give us your own thoughts on the topic. Thank you very much. Dr. Sewanyana, your video and audio are still.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you so much, moderator, and thank you so much, Dr. Magara, for your presentation. And I do think that the timing of this webinar is really very good. It is being done at a time that when we are trying to think through how best can we support the recovery of the Ugandan economy as a policy think tank. I wanted to just in a minute to tell you what EPRC is. We are an independent think tank. We are based at Makerere University, but we are not really part of Makerere University, and we also get support from government, and we are not part of government. So I don't know where Dr. Magara can now put us in terms of the different types of think tanks. But that said, I think the way I can look at what we are discussing now is like we are trying to bring out the importance of research and development, but with a perspective from the think tanks. That's how I can be able to treat it. And I totally agree that the think tanks are still critical in the national policy systems. They are very critical in the entire knowledge systems, and they must be supported where possible. I just wanted to bring out an example to demonstrate how important the think tanks are. Since Dr. Magara tried to really bring in the issue of COVID, I wanted to demonstrate to me where I thought it was very, very obvious that we really needed the information for us to be able to do whatever I wanted to do. And this was with a case of food distribution in Kampala and other areas. The system did not fail because government did not have the money, did not have the food. It failed because they did not know where these vulnerable people are. They did not have a system of locating them. They did not have a system of knowing exactly who is vulnerable and so on. I think that's why the entire system failed. And I do think that this requires us to have an effective management system around, around some of these issues. The second thing that I think that has come out of the paper very strongly is on the opportunities. How do we tap into the opportunities that are coming out of the situations that we find ourselves in? And the paper raises a very good point on multi-sectoral planning. And as he was presenting, I was asking myself, how about the think tanks? Are they working in a multi-sectoral approach? Are we working in a multidisciplinary approach? So those are some of the questions that kept coming to me, that probably we need to see how we can position the think tanks into the multi-sectoral planning and into the multi-sectoral disciplinary approaches. As we are now, we are working in silos. I may not know, I'm not interested in what ACORD is doing, and ACORD may not be interested in what EPRS is doing, and so on. So at the end of the day, it becomes very, very difficult for the policymakers to be able to connect the dots. So I have a feeling that we really need to see how best we can be able to work together. And I think the other thing which did not come out, which I thought did not come out strongly in the paper, is the multi-sectoral execution. You can do the planning following a multi-sectoral approach, but the execution might fail you. And I think the multi-sectoral execution did help a lot in the earlier days of the lockdown, where you saw all sectors working together. So we need to see how best we can bring that on board. The other thing that I picked from his paper is on that strategic leadership is very important at the think tank level, that the think tanks have to be innovative because things have changed. We need to be innovative in the way we think of ourselves, the way we support the policy systems, and all that. We need to really be able to be strategic. The other point which I picked from his paper, though it doesn't come out directly, is on the need to understand Uganda's knowledge ecosystem. The paper tries to hint a bit around it, but not so much. But I think we need to understand more of the knowledge ecosystems in Uganda for us to be able to benefit out of what is coming out. He talked about the academia, that academia is, they are more in training than research. And I do not totally agree with him. Academia, at least where I sit, Makerere University is doing a lot of, Makerere University is doing a lot of research. The only problem that
Dr. Muvawala, kindly mute your audio, but we'll be coming to you very shortly. Dr. Sewanyana, you have to go.
Yes, I think Makerere University, I'm talking on behalf of Makerere University, but I don't know about the others. Makerere is doing a lot of research. The only problem that we see from where I sit is how to communicate this research. When you go to the Faculty of Agriculture, they do a lot of research. When you go to College of Medical Health Sciences, they do a lot of research. I think the issue is how do we now communicate, or how do we do knowledge brokering so that whatever they've researched on can be able to reach policymakers. He also talked about lack of preparedness for the crisis. Yes, it's true. This caught us unaware, but we have really some good examples where we can be able to pick a leaf. And one of the examples I think is Vietnam, where Vietnam was able to manage the crisis better than anybody else. Probably we need to be able to also recognize some of those examples that are really good. The other thing that he raised was on the knowledge generation, that we need to promote the local think tanks. And I was asking myself, now we are talking about boo-boo. So how can we boo-boo the knowledge that we generate? And as we generate this information, I think the other question that we have to ask ourselves, who is going to demand for this information? Do they have the capacity to demand for it in the first place? Do they have the capacity to search for it? And do they have the capacity to use it? Okay, so those are some of the questions that we need to be asking ourselves and to see how best can we really promote uptake of the information that we generate. I also wanted to comment on the role of NPA in all this. I think Godiba was right, and I think that's what also I heard, that NPA is a government think tank. I think it is not, it may not be true. I look at NPA in terms of synthesizing all the knowledge that has been generated from other think tanks, to synthesize it and then make sense out of it. NPA can also be a knowledge broker, where it can be able to play a role between research and then policy. It can also be a knowledge broker. So, but it cannot be a government think tank. I think that is overstretched. And the experience from EPRC in terms of promoting uptake, we've been able to, we are proud that we have been able to, where possible, we've been able to inform the government policies. And at the very beginning of EPRC, I think we tried to be confrontational in some areas, but we've learned that if you are confrontational, you are not going to manage the government institutions. So what we've decided to do, that you have to engage them from a constructive angle so that they can sit back and listen to you, and then you can be able to discuss. And this has really worked for us. It's not true that government may not want to hear what you have to say, but I think the approach also matters so much. And I think the other thing that James talked about was the role of the private sector. This is very, very critical. Though at times I sit back and I ask myself, who is the private sector here? Can we define the private sector? Okay. I think defining private sector is as complex as defining a think tank. So once we've defined what a private sector is, then you can be able to engage the private sector with the knowledge that we have generated so that they can really pick it up for their lobbying purposes. On the funding, which Godiba talked about, I'm about to finish. I think funding is going to be a very, very big problem for think tanks in Africa, and in particular Uganda, because most of us have been depending so much on external funding, where you are able to fund most of your activities and so on. And this is going to be a very, very big problem. But on the side of EPRC, we are still lucky that we are still getting more than 75% of our funding from the government of Uganda, and it has kept us going. So we don't know what happens as we move forward, but at least we are still getting that funding from government of Uganda, and we remain an independent institution, and nobody can influence what we have to say. What is important for us is to engage them constructively, as well as being objective in whatever we do. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sarah Sewanyana, for sharing your strategic and even tactical approaches to succeeding as a policy think tank. Indeed, I think many can relate that the question is, how then does the product, which for many might be abstract for specialist and expert audiences, how does that product go beyond the website and the primary audience it was intended to? How does a Christian seated in Kampala make sense of it? I think it's something that is beyond universities. It must be even for institutions, government institutions, and anyone involved in these spaces. I now have the pleasure to invite our last discussant, and allow me to abridge his intro, because Dr. Muvawala has informed us he has to go to his son's wedding. We are both grateful that you could stay here, and we do apologize for being the reason you're not there already. But we all know Dr. Muvawala as the Executive Director of the National Planning Authority, and prior to that, he worked as an economist in the African Development Bank. Dr. Muvawala, some things came up about the place of NPA in the thinking space. Is it a government think tank? Is it a synthesizer of thought effort of the country? And then your own thoughts on the topic of think tanks and national planning. You're most welcome, Dr. Muvawala.
Thank you very much. I don't know whether you have me now. Hello?
Yes, we can hear you. We can't see you, but that's good enough. We can hear you loud and clear.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much. First and foremost is to thank Dr. Magara for the presentation. It is a very well thought presentation. Secondly, I'm not going to take a lot of time discussing the place of NPA because NPA is placed by law. I'm not about to change that law. Two things are clear in the post-critical for us as government. But the most important thing is the place of is the coordinator of think tanks within government. What comes out of the think tanks? That PA is a government, but whether it should be fully a government think tank is another matter. I tend to agree with both that NPA should strengthen itself more in synthesizing. Must be like what you must have the capacity to understand what think tanks do, interpret what think tanks do, and be able to promote it. Now, two things have happened in this post-COVID era. One, we are beginning to see the emergence of these think tanks that are giving us a lot of critical information. But one of the problems that I see is how do we take this critical information into government policy? Because as far as government is concerned, I can tell you that government is very weak at financing think tanks. In most cases, we finance those we like. Finance you. And you need to take any think tank who comes in the government space and comes in a confrontational manner is unlikely to succeed. The same with NPA. I have learned over the period that I've led this institution that every time we take a confrontational approach, we tend not to succeed. It is a lot of politics in government and how you win acceptance within the system if these think tanks are going to work. And as far as I'm concerned, the most important issue is going to be with the funding of these think tanks. Funding of think tanks, Sarah can tell you to get into the budget of government. Given, and we haven't gotten out of COVID to do with how do we deal with risk management within the system of government. That is an area which we forget about. We write very good programs, and 2 years later, the assumptions have not been fulfilled, and we don't understand how this has happened. So as far as I'm concerned, is to thank you that we are taking this direction. Two is for the ministry that is in charge, which is the Prime Minister's Office of impact evaluation and evaluation of government, to give us the agenda of government. What is the research agenda of government? That is lacking. Nobody is leading the research agenda of government, because we do not want our partners to come into this space and spend resources on things we are not yet very interested in. Right now, we are dealing with the import and increasing productivity of the country and production so that we can replace some of the imports. It is critical that our public policy think tanking goes around that idea. That's where the heart of the president is. And as you come to this space, I want to tell you that the most important thing here is the political acceptance. If we don't get political acceptance, we have a problem. And I have noted with concern that in this government now, very much, I recall writing the plan and giving an objective for CSOs. But I feel that's a big mistake. and this think tanking space, these are CSOs, non-government organization, which should be very strong because they come with advantages. Number one, implementation advantage. Number two, human resource advantages. Number three, experience. So I think what we have to do right now, for me, my most important issue would be how do we coordinate this think tanking within the country? And I think that would be one role that the NPA should play very well. I agree with you. We could start pulling NPA out of the space of trying to do research itself because we don't even have the resources. And uptaking all the research that all other think tanks do and promoting it within government. Because NPA's advantage is that we are conveners. As it convene any authority in government. As the chairman of the NPA board, you can convene any minister in government. We sit in cabinet. So what we have to do is to implement one of the major roles of NPA, which has been very weak. That is the area where they require us to work with CSOs and to work with the private sector to appraise performance of government. We need to create an work with you in this, the work you, and that as you do the work, we understand the methodologies that you use. I have seen people in think tanking who want to give me a model and hide the information behind the model. We are not going to be able to promote such knowledge if you are hiding how you have arrived at your results. We should be able to check your results and then be able to promote them. So for me, the takeaway today is for me to rethink how to place NPA in this public policy space. But I want to warn that we should push government very much in the area of financing. While my brother from Accord was saying that he has found his way of trying to moderate the sources of financing, I am also very experienced in this area. He who pays the piper calls the tune. I can see right now that government is getting into financing EPRC. EPRC is becoming very productive, very, very productive, that they are now leading the agriculture agenda. The the PIMA, so that I think that's the way to go. But and then require the Prime Minister. I hope I'm on. I'm done. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Muvawala. We missed bits and pieces in what you said, but it's not as if we did not get the gist. You're asking who is leading the research agenda for government. How do we coordinate the effort for think tanking, funding issues? You've shared your experience. We are very grateful. There are some questions that I am not sure you'll be able to attend to right now, but feel free to leave as you wish, as your time doesn't allow. But otherwise, I would invite you to wait and we listen to our special guest who is speaking right now, so that then we can have the questions later.
I'll be around and about. Don't worry,
okay.
I'll find a way.
Okay, thank you. I'll let you know if there is anything we would like you to specifically address. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, it is quite hot in the chat room, and I again invite the panelists to go and have a look in there and see what you can answer. I want to make it easy for those who have to run. So I will straight away go to inviting our special guest of the day, who has been listening very patiently and very quietly. We all know Dr. Ezra Suruma. I know him personally as somebody who inspires me for his care for economic justice and the plight of people who do not get to make it to the boardrooms and where decisions are being made. But I'll give a biographic brief so that we know him even as he's coming to speak. Honorable Ezra Suruma is currently the Chancellor, Makerere University, Uganda. He is also the Senior Presidential Advisor for Finance and Planning in the Office of the President and head of the Prime Minister's Delivery Unit in the Office of the Prime Minister here in Uganda. Before assuming the position of advisor in 2009, he was Minister for Finance, Planning and Economic Development and a Member of Parliament. Professor Suruma was awarded a prize by the Banker magazine of the Financial Times of London as the best finance minister in Africa in the year 2008. Following a distinguished academic career in universities in Uganda and the United States as a professor of economics, Mr. Suruma joined the government of Uganda as Director of Research in the Central Bank in 1987 and rose to the rank of Deputy Governor of the Bank of Uganda in 1990. And from 1993 to 1996, he served as the Chairman / Managing Director of the Uganda Commercial Bank, then Uganda's largest bank. From 1998 to 2004, he was the Director for Economic Affairs at the Movement Secretariat, where Uganda's ruling party, which is the secretariat for the country's ruling party, and this was prior to becoming the Minister for Finance. Mr. Suruma has been a significant player in stabilization, reconstruction, restructuring, and management of the Ugandan economy since 1986. He has always maintained a passion for economic justice and economic emancipation of the Ugandan people. He was a distinguished visiting fellow of the Brookings Institute in 2010 to 11, where he authored and published a path-breaking book on the economic development of Uganda. He is married to Mrs. Speciosa Suruma, and they have 10 children, of whom 6 are adopted orphans. His hobbies are tennis and music. Professor Suruma is a founder member of the Ugaford Microfinance Bank, a board member of the Uganda Debt Network, and board chairman of Everlight College, Kampala. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome with me Dr. Ezra Suruma to speak on the topic think tanking and national planning. You're most welcome, sir. Dr. Suruma, kindly unmute your audio so that we can hear you. We can see you very well.
Thank you very much, Christine. I wasn't hearing your last few remarks. My internet is unstable. I hope you can hear me, and I'm sorry that the internet is not so stable. I'll do the best I can. Yes, thank you very much for your kind introduction. You can hear me?
Yes, we can. We can.
Oh, wonderful. I would like to start by thanking CASO for inviting me to your webinar today. Thank you very much, and specifically Dr. Magara. Thank you very much for your think piece, as you call it. It's indeed a think piece. I found it very well thought out, addressing a very, very important subject of how we face the future. Because I think both research and planning are about how we face the future, how we solve critical issues that we face. And today in the context. Hello?
We can still hear you. There was a brief echo, but I think it has passed.
Okay, thank you. So let me get into the key issues first affecting the impact of think tanks. The capacity to focus on specific problems of sectors, I think, is very, very important. So that by focusing on a problem, you are able to get deeply into it and to collect the necessary data and to analyze the data with evidence. And these days, preferably real-time data. In the past, there's been too much reliance, I think, on old data. But now we are in an era where, because of a digital revolution, we need to know what is happening now. And if we can collect data in real time, then it becomes vital. And this, I think, we touch on the point that Dr. Sewanyana was making about our ability to have an effective food distribution system not being effective because we don't have real-time data of where people are, who they are and where they are, and their incomes and so on. So I believe that think tanks need to dive into this very critical area of being able to collect data and analyze it in real time and avail it to the public and to the government so that the findings can impact public policy. The issue of communication was touched on. It's very, very important. When I was at Brookings Institution in 2010, 2014, I found that I had just ended my tenure as the Minister of Finance. And one of the most important lessons that hit me like a bulldozer was the effectiveness of communication of the Brookings Institution. I realized that we did many things in government in Uganda, but we did not have that skill, incredible skill of communicating effectively. And when I did write a piece, it would go first and foremost to the communication department, and they would craft it. And when I saw it, I would not believe it is the piece that I had authored. They would do it so much better than I could do as a professor and experienced policymaker. So communication, which you touched on, Dr. Magara, I think is very, very important that the think tanks, when they have synthesized knowledge for potential use in policy, they are able to communicate it effectively, clearly and effectively. And this is an area where even government needs help to communicate effectively to the general public. The purpose of think tanks tends to be subjective, tends to reflect the financiers, and various speakers have touched on this, so I'll not dwell on it so much. I think it was Godba who tried to convince us that he can somehow manage the financiers and be able to do what he wants outside the bounds or limits that might be set by the financiers. I hope so. I would like to say that particularly in the case of Uganda, where much of this funding tends to come from outside, that we have that weakness, which we need to get over. And therefore, I would agree with Dr. Magara and others that government being able to come in more liberally, more generously to finance think tanks, put aside some funding for think tanks, and then perhaps have a body, a neutral body that is able to distribute that money to various think tanks so that it becomes not so political. I think this would be a great idea, and I think we should certainly attempt to do that. Otherwise, we'll continue to be dependent on foreigners who have their own ideologies, have their own interests, and then our think tanks will be reflecting these foreign interests rather than our interests. And that's, I think this is extremely important. It's an idea that we should discuss further so that we have what Dr. Magara, I think, called intellectual independence. I don't know if such a thing exists, but maybe some measure of impartiality or some measure of unbiased thinking is possible. Government think tanks may face the challenge of intellectual independence. That is true, because they are there to assist the government. And this is a very important point, which I think I should bring out. And Mr. Muvawara touched on it. The point of whose ideas, whose policies, whose research, whose ideas should be listened to. In the Prime Minister's delivery unit that I had, this has been a fundamental issue. When I go to address the permanent secretaries, each permanent secretary thinks his department is the most important. So now what do? We cannot prioritize everybody, because if you prioritize everybody, that means there's no priority. Everybody is equal. And yet we know that we don't have enough resources to do all the things that we want to do. So we have to select, prioritize, select what is number one, what is number two, what's number three. And that is important because civil servants have their priorities, ministers have their priorities, MPs have priorities. And in my opinion, because at any one time we have only one government and one leader, unless there is respect for the mandate that the leader of the country has as the leader of government, and therefore his prioritization should be the one that is most respected and implemented, then we are going to be bogged down. And you find that in many ministries, in many areas, there's actually no priority. People are just floating. When the wind goes left, they go left. When the wind goes right, they go right. They don't have a direction. And that lack of priority or lack of direction is a serious problem. And so if you are a think tank, presumably you are doing something that is relevant to their priority, then you have something to contribute in the implementation of that priority. If your idea is not relevant to what government has prioritized, then of course you don't expect government to be interested in listening to you. But maybe the public is, or maybe someone who has funded you is certainly interested in your results, and that's fine. I think that we have to recognize that we are in an environment where we are not only informing government, but informing the public and the world, contributing to knowledge in Uganda, in East Africa, and in the world, and not merely specific government policies. Now, I liked the categorization of think tanks and description of think tanks, the academic ones, the contract ones, the advocacy ones. I think this is a very important classification. I think that academic think tanks have a potential to contribute strongly if they are supported, because they are likely to be less biased, in my view, perhaps less biased, less ideologically interested. I don't know how to put it. So then we can assist the like MISA and Makerere, like EPRC. We can assist them to do more work that will be not so biased politically. But if you are an advocacy think tank like Godba, I'm not sure how Godba, you are my friend, I'm not attacking you. Then of course we have to know that they have an agenda. And does that agenda, because the idea that truth is neutral, I find it hard to buy. It's hard to find neutral truth. Recently, we've watched the Republicans and Democrats in the US debating the impeachment of the president. The Democrats have one set of facts with their think tanks. The Republicans have a different set of facts with their think tanks. So where is the truth? I will leave that for another time, because presumably the think tanks are looking for truth that can help our country move forward. But that truth will be debated, will be divisive in some cases. And as you've indicated, we have advocacy think tanks, we have political party think tanks. So this means we are going to have a lively environment in which the search for truth is vibrant, and it's good that the debate should have the contributions of these various think tanks. Hopefully, in so doing, we might have a finer sense of what is true and what can help us to move forward. So on think tanks, therefore, their role is very important, in my opinion, in awakening the public to what is going on, in awakening the government to what is the truth, what is the reality, because sometimes the government can have wrong facts, the public can have wrong facts, and think tanks can help in indicating the true facts. But we have to be careful, because the think tanks may be reflecting the underlying ideology or advocacy, and so we have to be careful that indeed there is a lively debate which helps the truth to come out. And so then we go to planning, the relationship between think tanks and planning. You're right to point out the early days of planning starting in 1961. I think I was in secondary school at that time at King's College Budo when the first plan came out. We thought it was a wonderful idea. We knew even then that planning was something that was mainly done in the East, in the communist countries. And at that time, the time of the Cold War, there was a sharp division between communism and capitalism. There was a big struggle. But I would say that it was courageous for Obote to come up with a 5-year development plan. But let me also mention that actually, before the colonialists left, they had brought in the World Bank to do a study by Professor Edward Mason. The study was the economic development of Uganda. It's a big book. And that was the basis of the first 5-year plan. And in the foreword to the plan, Milton Obote acknowledged that that plan was based on that research. So, which means, of course, that because we had to play between capitalism and communism, we had to be non-aligned, as it were. We are using a socialist technique, which was planning, 5-year plans, but yet we had a lot of influence from the West, in form of the World Bank and so on, and the colonialism had gone in name, but not in fact. So we started planning kind of one foot in one camp and one foot in the other. The plan had reasonable success in terms of implementation. Economic growth was, I think, about 6% at that time. The second plan came in, it was a bit better and more detailed than the first one. And then, of course, as you said, Idi Amin came and pushed out everything so that in the 70s, we had a big decline in the economy. Up to 1985, the economy was mainly declining or growing very, very slowly. Let me mention that in planning, we have this contradiction, which I think you have referred to as you talk about the private sector being involved. Planning, as I said, is originating from socialist economies, where the private sector is excluded. That's macro planning, of course, the national planning. In the West, the planning is at the farm level, the company level, where the price theory, economics of the farm is where the planning is done. But at the macro level, you don't find a 5-year plan or 10-year plan that I'm aware of covering the economy of the United States. So we have competing ideologies you have the private sector, which plans at a micro level. And then you have the national plan, which is covering the whole country, especially for infrastructure. So when you say that we bring them together, I think you need to be a bit more specific, a bit more careful. I do agree that we should consult the private sector when we are planning. But also we have a contradiction in that how does the government plan for the private sector? Because the private sector is private and independent, as it were. We want to create an environment where they can thrive, but they don't want us to tell them what to do. And so the capitalism and communism and mixed economy, and these days I think we are looking at a hybrid of capitalism and communism in China, where you have both systems being put together. And that's where I think we need to look very, very closely now and see what can we learn from China, because they are taking market policy principles of supply and demand. At the same time, they are using planning, very careful, detailed planning, down to the village level. So we need to learn from here that the old idea of laissez-faire, of course, that you leave the economy alone and so on, and the economy will develop itself. We know that this is really not effective. We've seen that if we leave, for example, when they said that if we leave the banks alone, they will spread to the rural areas. When I became Minister of Finance, I said, where are the branches that you told me would go to the rural areas 10 years ago? They had not gone. And that's when we started bringing in SACCOs and so on and microfinance as a way of bridging that gap. So yes, there is an important role for think tanks, in fact, on how planning should be done, and how much we can learn from the Asian economies or Chinese and Russians and so on, and how we can integrate this into a private sector environment so that we can benefit from both. And let me say that recently we had coffee as an example of how the private sector and the public sector can work together. Coffee is grown by ordinary farmers, most of them small. But the president said we should increase coffee production to 20 million bags by 2020, extraordinary. But when he issued the directive in 2014 October, by 2015, when it was given to the delivery unit, nothing had been done. In fact, the Coffee Development Authority had a different agenda. They had a different strategy of going to 6 million bags by 2018, as if unaware of what the president had had said. And here I'm getting into implementation. It's not enough to plan. We have to implement. If you plan and there's no implementation, there's no benefit. So when the plan was given to us in the Prime Minister's office, now we started pushing. The Rhetoric, we have what we call pressure for results. We have to keep putting pressure on sectors, putting pressure on finance to finance seedlings. Because the president said we should distribute 300 million seedlings, but there was no money in the budget for these seedlings. Now we have come and put maximum pressure, and the money was found, and the seedlings were produced and distributed. There was some measure of corruption in the distribution of seedlings, but we got into verification and so on. How are these seeds being planted and so on? So planning and follow-up and so on and so forth. Very, very critical and very, very important. And these are some of the areas where think tanks, again, can come in and say, okay, there is this policy, but how is it working? Who is doing what? And monitoring. Are things happening as they are supposed to do? Evaluation. What has come out of this plan? And that puts pressure on the government and on those who are implementing these things, that they are not wasting government resources. And let me mention that in our attempt to increase, by the way, we are now at 7 million bags, which is double where we were 4 years ago, and which puts us only 0.3 of a million, because the Ethiopian output, which is the biggest output in Africa, is estimated to be 7.3 million. So I think we are going to overtake Ethiopia very soon as the biggest coffee producer in Africa. But we had to prioritize and focus on just this one crop. And by doing that, we could see that it can be really effective when we prioritize, when we focus. And when we bring in, we were assisted by Pamandu, which is a think tank in Malaysia. We are assisted by McKinsey and Company, which is a global consultancy firm. They came in, we had a lab, what we call a lab methodology for a whole week. We are meeting all the stakeholders in the coffee sector. Through this consultation, we are able to get effective, relevant knowledge and cooperation of the various people in cooperatives and so on, and growers and exporters and transporters of coffee. And so I'm just giving an example of how indeed stakeholders can be brought in and we can have results if we prioritize, if we focus on implementation, if we have stakeholders being involved, we can have we can have results. What impact will the aftermath of the pandemic have on our national planning process? I think this is a very complicated question, to be frank. I'm glad you're talking about preparedness. I'm not sure how prepared anyone could be for COVID-19. Yes, we should be prepared for disasters. Perhaps we could have more reserves, I don't know. But I don't want to pretend that I know how we can prepare for such unprecedented, or maybe it's precedented, I don't know. But certainly by having data, real-time data, down to the households, in the rural areas, knowing where people are, where they live, and their incomes and so on, we can be better prepared and better able to assist our people in Uganda. I don't know how much more time I have.
3 minutes to end.
3 minutes? Okay, so your recommendations about the private sector, I already commented on that. Your point on dependency is critical. Dr. Magara, I thank you for bringing that out, that we have to avoid over-dependency on foreign financing and foreign institutions, because it makes us dependent and makes us, when we were trying to redesign the economy, rebuild the economy in 1986 onwards, we were overwhelmed by these think tanks. We're talking about of Reaganomics, They are coming and giving conditionalities. We needed money. I'm on record as refusing some of these conditionalities, but I was overruled because we needed money. We had to sell Uganda Commercial Bank. I opposed it, but we were overruled because we needed money for balance of payments, to buy salt and soap. Our shops were empty. So over-dependency is wrong, not only in loans and donations, but also in thinking, because we find that we are being deceived, we are following wrong policies, and that's catastrophic. In the end, we find ourselves in the ocean. So I agree with you. We should put pressure on government to finance our research so that we have homegrown indigenous solutions. I've already commented on disaster preparedness. Yes, we should be prepared, but I have to be frank that I'm not sure how. I need to hear more about your scenarios and simulations and how they can help, because it sounds very complicated to me. We should institutionalize think tanks for the public sector, develop national vision, policies, strategies. I agree. A well-resourced, officially designated think tank capacity is definitely important. We should have a robust intellectual system of our own. Universities, definitely they harbor brains that should be promoted, and we're also assisting them to communicate their research findings more. And of course, this is where the state sponsorship also should continue to go. Not only government universities, but even private universities should be assisted by government to do research. Think tanks for political parties, I couldn't agree with you more. At least they should have some knowledge of what they are talking about, because we are tired really of total rubbish and parties that have absolutely, as you said, those when they are talking to the ordinary people themselves, there is hardly any difference. And that's embarrassing and dangerous, because one of the reasons I joined politics back in 1980 was when Professor Mshanga said that if intelligent people refuse to join politics, they must accept to be ruled by fools. And I said, no, I'm not going to accept anymore to be ruled by fools. We're just coming out of it, that means rule. So if we don't have informed people in political parties, then we will have uninformed policies or no policies at all, and it will be a disaster. So I couldn't agree with you more about the critical importance and then of course we see the case in Germany where the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung and Konrad Adenauer foundations support directly political parties, and they are here even in Uganda, but they are attached to the political parties in Germany. So your point about the involvement of private sector and think tanks in evaluating government performance, I'm not so sure, but it's an interesting point that maybe we can discuss at some point. In conclusion, I agree that we should strengthen a national planning authority. Personally, I think that a think tank, because they think and they put together data and correct policies. So I don't want to be too technical about the definition of a think tank, but they are a very important body of knowledge and statistics and data and planning. We should fund MISA and EPRC more and other think tanks and other universities, as we said. If we don't, we'll see ourselves turned over and over by subsequent waves that will hit our world, be they pandemics, wars, or other kinds of disasters. I'm quoting you. I couldn't agree with you more that we should attempt to have more preparedness and to have more focused leadership based on knowledge, or deep thinking, as you put it, and evidence-based policy making. So I want to thank you very much. I hope that long-term planning will indeed be indispensable, that everyone, all stakeholders, will be consulted in policy making, that will make opportunities available for think tanks to engage with both the public and private sector. I thank you very much.
And I thank you very much, Dr. Ezra Suruma, on behalf of all the attendees. I think Zoom has not yet provided us with features like drum rolls or audible applause, but it's been very refreshing hearing you bring together the historical, your experience-based perspectives of how we can improve, how our country harnesses its thinking. The think piece will benefit from the places where you've said, yes, we need to think about how to do these things practically, and the cautions and the scenarios that we are talking about. We will be going into the Q&A, and what I will do is go to each panelist and ask a few questions. I can see that some have already been addressed in the chat, and I encourage that whoever still has a question do so that we can continue along those lines. I had earlier promised everybody a poll question. Unfortunately, we can't have it here, but we shall do it on Twitter. And I encourage you, go to Twitter. Step 1, follow Castle. Step 2, take the poll questions. I also want to recognize Professor Nawangwe, Barnabas Nawangwe. He's on the call, and indeed, he's asked some questions on the chat. Let me, while you're still on, Dr. Suruma, ask you a question. And now, this is looking at both your current experience and your past experience. There is a joke commonly told by somebody I'm sure you know very well, Ramadan Gobi, that the only policy not yet written here is the policy for implementing policies and government plans and decisions. As the head of the Prime Minister's Delivery Unit, you really sit at a vantage point. You have a unique view of the manner in which the national implementation machinery is supposed to work, or how it actually runs. And every year at budget time, or even in between, there are questions about implementation bottlenecks, budgets are not absorbed, objectives are not met, things are not implemented. What have you seen? What is the incentive to deliver? What are the actors doing or not doing right? Is this something we can change? What can we do differently from what your experience is?
I'm afraid, can you hear me? I'm having internet trouble.
Oh, yes, we can hear you very clearly.
Oh, okay. So I heard a bit of what you said about implementation at the Prime Minister's office. We have found that one, I mentioned prioritization. That there is a lot that government is doing, but at any one time, it's very important to focus on a few things and concentrate resources and efforts, intellectual effort and so on, and monitoring and evaluation on those few things. So that way you are likely to go further than if you're trying to cover everything. That's number one, prioritization. Number two is the coordination. I think this probably speaks to Dr. Magara's point of multi-sectoral. The point is, for example, we've been working on stopping or reducing teacher absenteeism in primary schools, because the literacy passing of primary school children for a long time has been very low, about 50%. And we said this must be rectified. And to rectify it, we found that one of the key problems is very, very high absenteeism of teachers in primary school. But to stop that absenteeism, you have to coordinate public service, which pays the salaries of these teachers. You have to coordinate that with local government of the cows, which oversees the local government in the districts. You have to coordinate with the district head education officer, who is in charge of the schools in the district. You have to coordinate with the Ministry of Education itself, which is in overall charge of education. So the Prime Minister's vantage point then we found is indeed being able to coordinate various sectors in order to achieve such what are apparently small thing as teacher absenteeism, but which is in some places as high as 65% of the teachers, only 35% being present. So we brought it in 22 districts in the East where we are working. We managed to bring teacher presence to 96%, but that implementation requires focus and even bringing real-time data collection. We have to collect data every day in every school, get the data sent to the health, education officer. It's entered into a computer, it is sent to us, and we're able to react and send back our views together with Ministry of Education and Public Services informed, so that teachers who have been absent, action can be taken. So yes, implementation is critical and it requires coordination at the center of government. That's one of the lessons we've learned.
Thank you very much. And one last one for you before I go to the other panelists, at least last for now, is, and this is back to your experience in Uganda's reforms, is we followed the Washington consensus, Dr. Williamson's Washington consensus thinking, back to the thinking subject for those economic reform programs. And that was those that stabilized the post-conflict 1990s. Today, who's thinking or what thinking are we following? And how, in your view, are we faring?
That's a very good question, madam. I hope you're not going to put me in trouble. We are still getting money from various sources to the extent that when I was director of research in 1987, I was coordinating these structural adjustment program discussions, and it was a struggle and a resistance to end those ideas would mean the next tranche of the money would not come until you have fulfilled the conditionalities. But when I became Minister of Finance in 2005, our dependency had decreased. And so I could say no. I could say no to those policies. I could say, no, I don't like this. And they would have to listen to me or change, because now I had more independence. So the more independence we have in terms of financing our budget and not depending on the resources or having alternative sources of money like China and so on, then of course that means we have a bit more freedom than when we are dependent on any one donor. And I hope that my view then as now is that we should increase budget independence and reduce external dependency.
Thank you very much, Dr.
Then we can form our own views of what we think is best for Uganda.
Okay, I thank you very much for taking those questions. We are going to ask the other panelists a few questions now, and then we'll come back to you during the wrap up for any other views you may have. And you end on a note that is about our budget situation. Not on the panel, but in the room, we have somebody from the Ministry of Finance who's representing Mr. Kagwa. And so I'm going to put that question to him. Let me now go to the other panelists. And I can see that a lot of the questions have been taken. Thank you for that. But I want to ask, do we still have Godba? I know he had to drop off at some point. Are you there, Mr. Tumushabe? Okay, perhaps not, I think.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
I think I'm on now.
You are on now, yes, yes. I have a question for you, and that is coming from extending the presentation, the observation in the paper that our think tanks in Africa have gained momentum only fairly recently. So is it a fair observation and comment that we have not made yet a clear distinction between the activism, social political activism, and think tanking? And from that, is that the risk that makes it easy to dismiss the work of a think tank that is, a bit active as just, you're politicking? Is there anything to say? Any truth?
No, I actually think that's a very, very interesting observation, because in a way, Mr. Mvawa and our senior citizen, Dr. Surumas, almost said something related to that in two different ways. One, that Mr. Mvawa says the knowledge for it to be accepted. What I had that, in terms of prioritization, you have government, you have one leader, and therefore the priorities of my personal view is that a marketplace of ideas, whether an organization, whether it's a political party, whether it is affiliated to a university, whether it is an independent, even advocacy think tank, they are creating knowledge and putting it into the marketplace of ideas. None of these institutions is instructing government to say you should take on these ideas. On the contrary, the idea is that government officials or policymakers should be able to have this
Okay, we're losing Godba.
of ideas that help inform them in making a decision. An institution like National in terms of synthesizing all these ideas, because here the independence and also comments, which comes through, which is normally referred to as confrontation.
Mm-hmm.
If you ask the people in this conference, they will understand confrontation differently. My understanding, having what government officials consider confrontation is when you tell them things that they don't want to hear. In other words, you've done your research and you've said, this problem has not been addressed and it needs to be addressed in this form. And if government is not interested in that kind of proposition, then they characterize it as confrontation. And I'll give you an example, and I hope Dr. Suruma or even Dr. Mvara could even comment on this. The one area where I think there has been consensus among the different think tanks, whether they are academic like EPRC, whether they are advocacy like a code, even in Parliament, by the way, I have a study from Parliament that looked at the creation of districts, and basically said creation of districts creates increases the cost of public administration. It does not translate into improved public service delivery. I know that there has been research by the World Bank on the same subject. I know that Minister of Finance has raised the same issue and said, we have no financing in this meeting. Know that government has continued to create this. I want us to appreciate that all these think tanks need to do their research, put them into the marketplace. Government officials then have the responsibility to be able to look at them and see what makes sense, what does not make sense, how does this help us move the policy agenda.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Now, another quick one, drawing on from that, because think tanks have agendas, have things that they're passionate about and driving. How does a think tank become aware of its own biases? And by extension, if those biases are carried through, the unsavory effects of those biases becoming tangible?
Yes.
How do you control?
Yeah, very important question, Christine. I think that for my experience has been that each one of us as individuals we have our own biases. Some of us are very, very politically active, and therefore we have certain political orientations. When you work with a think tank, first of all, a think tank should never kill the political orientation and political affiliations of its staff, of its researchers. It is perfectly fine for a person working with Economic Policy Research Center or for MISA to say, I'm openly a member of NRM or a member of FDC. What is important is the research that you are doing. Can it pass the test of credible research based on a clear methodology that it can pass the test of any examination, any intellectual examination? Can it pass? So I would disagree with anybody who says, oh, because that is the tendency in this country, that if you are affiliated to a political party, then you cannot do independent research. I would respectfully disagree with that kind of mindset.
Thank you very much, Godba. I know you are on the move. We will come back later for a wrap up, but I just wanted you to look at the chat and see. I want you to take the questions on whether you think tanks should be written into law or policy or mandated somehow by some instrument. A number of people asked that, and I would like you to look at that and give your view. Let me now call in Dr. Sarah Sewanyana. You've been quiet for a bit. We learned from you earlier that as a public policy think tank, the EPRC has found its footing, has understood the terrain and knows how to deal with different stakeholders for results. I want to understand what the result is from your viewpoint. And my question is, how do you evaluate the outcome or impact of your research in shaping policy beyond the outputs, beyond either being commissioned or proactively placing documents on the tables of those who need to see them? What is the EPRC doing? How does it evaluate the outcome or impact of that research?
Thank you so much. Before I go to my question, I wanted to add something to what Professor Sruma discussed around implementation. Yes, we need to have a multi-sectoral approach in implementation, but I think what we've noted over time that probably we need a program. Government needs a program where it can be able to strengthen the capabilities of the different institutions, and also to check on their level of effort so that you can be able to realize what we talk about. There are so many programs in government that really require multi-sectoral approach. They are well-written documents, but I think when it comes to implementation, that's where the problem is. But I think it could also be a capability issue that we need to think through. Then on the Godiba, I wanted to emphasize that probably, as Dr. Muvawala put it, I think we need to understand the knowledge ecosystems for Uganda for us to be able to see what are our entry points and so on. Understanding the ecosystem will be very good for all of us to be able to move forward. And what have we done in terms of EPRC when it comes to monitoring the outcome of our works? We do have a communication department, which is supposed to do all this. Earlier on, we used not to have a communication department, but we decided to have one, which helps us to track where EPRC's products are being used, and they are doing a very good job in terms of that. So we are now able, even when we look at the government documents, you can be able to see where our works are being cited. I leave it there.
Just before you leave that one,
Mm.
do you have, as the public, Umuntu Wawansi, Christine, or Akelo or Ninsima, wherever they are they a legitimate target? Is the communication department looking at everybody seated where they are? Anyone?
Yeah, we are trying to reach out to the media as much as possible. And we wanted, in one of our strategic objectives, was to really go back to the local governments, because that's where implementation takes place. However, we are not able to do that because of the budget. Our budget may not be able to allow us to do that, but we have the desire to go and reach them. We do have an initiative where we have this business climate index, where we've tried as much as possible to go to different regions, but not really reaching down to, say, businesses or reaching out to households and so on. We haven't been able to do that. Okay. But that would be something good to do.
And you bring up the question of funding. There is a question in the chat group by someone called AK, and he says, Dr. Sewanyana, is your funding model to depend on government funding 75% in perpetuity, or is it expected to end at some point? Couldn't government influence the EPRC directly or indirectly, e.g., through secondment of fellows? Do you have reserves to survive a disruption to government funding?
Yeah, we are still lucky as EPRC, as I said before. Government cannot at all at this material point, much as they give us the funding, it cannot influence what we put in our papers. What we try to do is we try to make sure that we understand we have an understanding of the stakeholder mapping, the stakeholders themselves that we are trying to target, because understanding your stakeholders is very, very critical for you to be able to know who is the influencer, who is going to detract you, and so on. It's very, very critical. And whenever we do research, that's the first thing we do, to understand who are the key stakeholders that we are trying to target, including donors. We try to do that. So in terms of influencing our works, no, it's not true. And our research agenda is developed by EPRC, but not by government. In terms of funding, earlier on, we used to depend on only around 25 to 40% of government funding. Unfortunately, one of our core funded project came to an end. The funding came to an end last year, and that was the IDRC think tank initiative. And what we are trying to do is to look out for other potential funders. And on a positive note, we've been able to get, though it is very small money, we've been able to get back to IDRC. So we do hope that it will be able to come back to fund most of our activities.
I will be letting you go shortly, but I just wanted you to respond to Dr. Nawangwe. This is his comment. He says the EPRC and MISA of Makerere are recognized internationally by the International Think Tank Initiative as successful think tanks. He believes their success is because they have focused on particular knowledge streams, and that is what think tanks should do. Don't do everything. So what is your view? And I think I'll ask the same to Dr. Magara when we get to you.
Yeah, I totally agree with that observation, because when you are everywhere, then you are nowhere. And what we've learned that if you really want to influence government policies and so on, even the donors themselves, you need to do in-depth analysis around an issue. than you being scattered here and there.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Sarah Sewanyana. We shall come back to you during the wrap up. We're now going to hear from Dr. Mvawala. If he has not, he had indicated that he would, he would keep the channel open. And I just want the team to let us know, because I'd like to move to Dr. Magara before we do the wrap up. But is Dr. Mvawala on, technical team? Okay, so we shall get to him should he come back. Earlier, I mentioned that the Ministry of Finance was represented. Mr. Kagwa couldn't make it, but somebody kindly stepped in for him. And this is a Commissioner, Mr. Joseph Enyimu. And I just wanted to put some, one or two questions to him. There's been the question of finance. It's been coming up, whether it's for the financing of think tanks or the financing of government programs itself, the financing of our budget, our independence, not just in terms of the thinking process, but also in terms of how we run our budget. My question is, inspired by the COVID time, that COVID has exposed the financial fragility of daily earners, the typical MSME person, and those that get money from an activity, especially customer-facing activity they get on a daily basis. So we are seeing that the dangers of lacking, not having universal safety nets might be now really, if we are now seeing what that means. And the question is, does the ministry have anything? Has this triggered any thinking around the need to boost social safety nets and build resilience of households, of the kind of people we are seeing that are so close to the margin that at any disruption, they tip over? I would like to enable Mr. Nyimu's audio, and that is just one question. We have one more, and if the audience has any other, you can put it in the chat.
Okay, thank you very much, Christine. Good morning. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you very clearly.
All right, thank you for having the ministry on your webinar. And to go straight to the question you have raised, yes, the ministry has delivered an economic response package to the COVID pandemic, which includes dimensions of social protection. Specific dimensions therein include expanding employment opportunities for the day-to-day wage earners through what we call labor-intensive public works. And I think we have an excess of over 150 billion shillings that has been dedicated to that. So we expect that all through at the level of local governments or our road maintenance authorities, will be able to uptake some of the people that may have lost livelihoods on account, but are able-bodied, they are able to work. You are also aware that that package includes the national rollout of the social assistance grant for empowerment, which targets our senior citizens 80 years plus. Previously, it was covering just a few set of districts. And then there are a couple of schemes targeting micro and household enterprises through microfinance, access to microfinance credit that has been packaged together to that effect. That is in terms of really an immediate response. But in terms of strategy, in the wake of COVID and post-COVID, I think that the guidance that HE has provided in terms of priority sectors, the so-called 14 production lines, which in a sense provides for an inclusive avenue for public investment to impact on livelihoods. So you know that a significant share of households, over I think 76%, derive livelihoods from agriculture. And Uganda's industrialization prospects are highly hinged on agro-industry. Working with actors like EPRC and private sector foundation, we have rolled out an agro industry strategy that is informing public investment. So we think that by raising productivity, addressing markets for these agricultural products, that is a medium-term strategy that should be able to bring a wider array of the population into the economic growth process in the COVID post or during this COVID era. So I will pause there for now, since you asked me a very specific question. I had some other inputs around the paper.
I would like to ask you to give those as well. Please go right
All right.
ahead.
Thank you. So in terms of the paper, I think that the piece is timely, it's relevant, it's strategic, and significantly comprehensive. So we commend CASO for that. I would like to say that, of course, the point made by Professor Suruma, ideological orientation is a very critical thing. Even as we talk about think tanking, this must be underpinned by an ideology that we have consensus really around, especially if we are trying to target the public sector. I think the critical thing which is silent in the paper, in my view, is the audience for this thinking seems to be heavily skewed to the public sector. Now, as you are aware that world over, I think where thinking has made a transformative impact, it has done so where there is a good relationship between academia, industry, and government. And that may speak to the point on funding. I think government would do well. The return on investment in think tanking is certainly high, but the funding strategy should not be, in my view, heavily dependent on the public purse. So the public purse would do well to provide what we call seed funding, but the core funding for think tanking should be something that we reach based on, in my view, competitive grants. So the ability of these think tanks to demonstrate that they can distill out broad issues and prioritize issues that are transformative. And the private sector, in recognizing that, would be willing to finance, especially given the fact that we are in a developing country and our fiscal space is not that very wide. The second point would be also for the CASO and the team to appreciate that one of the programs in NDP3 is a program called Public Sector Transformation, which is really lends itself very well to the whole notion of think tanking. How do we influence the way that public sector business is done and the culture of performance, evidence, orientation of decision-making and management. So I would recommend that you follow this up with the planning authority and you create a stronger synergies. Finally, I think that the recommendation by Dr. Magara about greater inclusion of the private sector, I think it has also underlooked what is already on the ground. So I would think it's good to recognize that, for example, government is a co-founder of Private Sector Foundation Uganda, which is kind of the umbrella platform really for the voice of the private sector. And it does the policy thinking around issues that influence the health of the private sector. It would be good for you to collaborate with actors like this. Of course, we have the Presidential Economic Council and other loose frameworks like the presidential investor round table mechanism that allows for consultation with players. But these platforms benefit from some serious background papers that I think think tanks such as CASO would do well to build collaboration or collaborative relationships with, so that you can influence the actors that play within that space. So finally, I know, let me make this my last point through. I think planning must be broken down to the 3 levels: strategic planning, programmatic planning, and finally operational planning. You may find that in most cases, our strategic plans are significantly of good caliber. The problem comes at the level of programming and operations, and how we take down ideas and concretize them into routines in institutions and these service delivery units. That is where transformation, in my view, or the next wave of the country's transformation will come from. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nyumu, for that practical and pragmatic insights, especially for Castle with regard to, and the whole question of collaboration. What are the channels that can exist, that do exist? I took note of the suggestion about competitive grants. It's nice to know that is within the general frame of thinking. Just before I leave you, if you can quickly tell us, what is the current ideation channel for the Ministry of Finance? How are you engaging even now with ideas from outside? How do they come through?
In the ministry, we've taken on a consultative approach to policy and budgeting. So for example, within the planning process, whereas we have a planning authority, of course, the parent ministry that it belongs to is the Ministry of Finance. So the NPA issues a calendar of some sorts that provides stakeholders an opportunity. They allow for sector-wide consultations, local government consultations, and the academia an integral part of that consultative process. Post the formulation of a development plan, we have annual cycle frameworks around the budget calendar. So the way we arrive at a national budget is that we have a nationally consultative process that informs the National Budget Conference sometime in September, October. And different actors, be they private sector, academia, local governments, or interest groups, that take the time to prepare themselves and put in materials that can facilitate constructive dialogue, that bring in place alternative ideas or options that are actionable, are able to take advantage of this fora. So I would recommend that people are made aware of the different consultative cycles within government. That is one. The private sector has increasingly become more and more organized. We have a private sector working group. We have a private sector foundation, Uganda, that also organizes its own constituencies to inform that process. The other avenues are more, they are not programmed, but as and when the opportunities. I think institutions like the National Population Council, the President's Office, somebody had a question on the research agenda. There is actually a research agenda which is updated annually by President's Office as the ministry in charge of the policy cadre. And here within finance, the department I belong to, we focus on the economic policy research agenda. And as you may be aware, EPRC is actually an outfit that originated with, from the Ministry of Finance. So those are some of the avenues that I can make mention of quickly in the time we have.
Thank you very much. So we're now going to begin to wrap up, and What I will do is I'll request Dr. Magara to speak last, to pick one or two questions that we are going to. I notice you've already answered a number of them, the majority of them on the chat. I really want to thank the audience. Those are great questions in the chat. And what we are going to do, for lack of time, is just to build them into the paper, and also make an effort to follow up on how we can use them, what comes out of them to enrich the paper. I will now ask the panelists that, I just want to give you a minute. If there's anything you think you want to say in this last minute, so that I go to our chief guest, and then we can draw this to a close with Dr. Magara. Godba, are you still on? I know you've been a bit itinerant. If he can't join us, that is okay. And I think he cannot, that is understandable. Dr. Sarah Sewanyana, give us a parting shot.
Thank you so much. I don't think I have much to say, other than thanking the organizers for inviting us to be part of this. Thank you so much. And I think my takeaway is how best can we strategically position our think tanks to make sure that we can respond to the different demands from different stakeholders, given the fact that we are now in the new norm. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will now request our chief guest, our special guest, Dr. Ezra Suruma, to please give us your parting shot.
It's been very lively, and I think you cannot see me. Let me see if I can be seen. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you so much for this wonderful interaction. It's been very lively and extremely thoughtful. I think that need for us to be more creative, to be more productive, producing knowledge by which we make policy, and also for educating our public so that our general public is better informed about the true state of affairs, is absolutely critical. If you are walking in darkness and you don't have a light, you are in very serious trouble. And the world in which we are, we either walk by the light that we believe is the truth, or we walk by someone else's light. And think tanks, therefore, deserve our support. But as we have seen, funding is a very serious matter. I would hope that from this discussion, we can find a way to influence our government to put aside a specific budgetary item for financing think tanks. And as Mr. Nyimu said, we could have, I think it was Mr. Nyimu, we could have a competitive fund that of grants that think tanks can compete for. We need planning as we're preparing for the future, or at least attempting to think about the future and approaching the future in a way that is not, we are not always being surprised. But I think most critical of all is that we are not being led like blind people and someone else is holding a stick and we are holding a stick and following them wherever they want to take us. So unless our think tanking, our public is able to organize this thought process, it's like a watchman. We started with a prayer. And the idea that you are watching, day and night, you are aware of what is going on around you. That's how you save yourself from thieves or from being attacked or being misled. If you are not watchful, if you are not alert, then our country, as indeed Dr. Magara correctly pointed out, there are going to be upheavals, there are going to be wars, there are going to be unforeseen events that will bring catastrophe. And of course, managing 100 million people by 2050 is not a simple matter. So it requires digital revolution in terms of having data of where our people are, what they are doing, what they are growing, what inputs are required, how we can improve these inputs so that we are producing more, maximizing production in agriculture and other areas. We have to, and this I think is work where the think tanking together with government can help us to go in the right direction. So I thank you for this effort. I hope it will not be the last, because it's so critical to shaping the future that we hope will be a good future and a better future for our country. Thank you very much.
And we thank you very much, Dr. Ezra Suruma, again for taking the time to speak to us this morning. Let me straight away invite in our lead presenter, also board chairman, and he leads the Castle think tank effort. And Dr. Magara, you have the freedom to speak to this the way you want. I know you've answered actually all the questions that were put to you. So do that and then bring us to a close. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kristen. And once again, thank you very, very much, all the panelists. It's been a very, very engaging morning. Time has gone so fast. And the Q&A part has also been extremely engaging. I'm glad we are having this kind of discussion. We need it. We very, very desperately need it. I think it was just one of the panelists underscored what mentioned earlier, that if we're going to get out of the trap we're in, we've got to use our minds. And I think it was Godba Tumshabe who mentioned, was asked that we should interrogate how we lost our thinking. In my book, Positioning Africa for the 21st Century, there's a chapter which deals with the journey of policy formulation in Africa, from the pre-colonial days to the colonial days. The impact of slavery is mentioned a bit, and then the time after independence, and then the military rule time, and then how did the Bretton Woods organizations, come in and just begin telling us what to do. We've been through a journey, and if we're to be free, we must be free in our minds and our thinking. So this kind of thing is very, very critical for us. There was a point mentioned about independence, rather of concentration. Yes, I do agree that you can't do everything. As CASO, we have some areas of concentration, but we thought this was a very good opportunity in view of the pandemic and the challenges posed by the pandemic to talk about, to have a broad sweep of the different areas. And that's what we are committed to doing this year. So there are going to be many more webinars coming up, and all of these are looking at opportunities that this pandemic has brought. But we do have some specific areas we are interested in as a think tank specifically, and one of them is education. The other point I'd make is a point made on communication. Yes, think tanks have to be able to present materials that are relevant to different groups. But also one of the things that is coming out very clearly here is the fact that as citizens, we don't know enough about what government is doing. Dr. Suruma did indicate that when he went to Brookings, he found out that communication was something they really excelled at. And I think this is an area, we do cover communication at some point, but it's an area which not only government, think tanks, governments, there's a lot. When you get to hear what government is doing, you realize there's a lot, but people don't know. And the area of communicating, I mean, even on this kind of distinguished panel, we can be ignorant of certain things. I think it tells a lot about what Christine calls Omuntu Wawansi. We need to improve greatly on that. I'm glad the NPA role came out. I'm not sure it's been concluded. Is NPA a think tank? Is it a synthesizer? It's something we need to know more about. because you could see from the panel that there was lack of agreement. And I hope these questions will help to further define the various roles. Especially NPA is a very important organization, but roles will be further defined. Funding has been mentioned, critical for intellectual independence. And I do hope, and we will continue to, beyond this, see how we can influence government to actually put aside money. We've got to pay for our thinking. And I did hear His Excellency once mention that we've paid a very, very big price for not thinking, or not thinking that thinking is important. We will have to, government will have to put its money in where its mouth is, if you may use that term. Finally, I can't overemphasize the importance of preparing for the future. I trained as a futurist, and when you see something coming, you want to prepare for it. That's what any prudent person does. If you see the weather is turning, it's going to rain, you get ready, you get your clothes out. You know, if you're going somewhere, you make sure you have an umbrella, you move indoors. That's what we do all the time. Now, when you begin to explore trends and you begin to see the future, you know, it gets scary sometimes. And as a country, we are one of the youngest countries in the world. We have a looming problem. It's already here. It's growing with unemployment. These are some of the areas where we can engage people to really think. I know we have some, you know, off the cuff answers, but how do we engage our population? How do we take advantage of this burgeoning number? I know there are others who say we should reduce the population. Well, even if we reduce the number of children at this stage, short of just killing people, you know, if every family just had 2-3 children, the population will continue to grow for some time. So this is something that this sort of things will need not just one person or a small group of people thinking. These are kind of projects that can be run from the center to help us bring our minds together and see how can we engage this population. So there are a lot of opportunities out there. And in the time that we're in, we have the ability to see what is coming. And I do hope we can take advantage of it. And thank you very, very much for participating in this morning's deliberations. I'll hand back to you, Christine. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Magara, for your parting shot and indeed for bringing this to a close. Mine is just to say thank you. Thank you very much to our panel. Before I finish that, I just wanted to, it's always great to see sages involved in something like this. So I want to recognize Professor Barnabas George Kiria, former Vice Chancellor, Makerere University, and we know him for other things as well, for staying with us from start to finish. And all of you attendees, the room is still full. Let me just say thank you to Dr. Ezra Suruma. Thank you very much to Dr. Sarah Sewanyana. Thank you very much to Mr. Joseph Enyimu. I will thank in absentia Dr. Joseph Muvawala and Mr. Godba Tumushabe for a very enlightening discussion. We've learned a lot from one another, and the way forward it's almost just beginning, but it's exciting. It's exciting to look at what the possibilities are, because even where we don't have strict consensus, I think we have a starting point. And so on behalf of the CASO team, I want to say we wish you a great weekend. We do this every weekend and we will be doing it for a while. Next weekend, we are talking about the energy sector. And as always, the skew is what are the opportunities given this season, given this disruption. So we'll be having another discussion with the relevant stakeholders in the energy sector. And we invite you to come for that one and those that will follow. A very great weekend, a very good day. Thank you very much. I bring this to a close here. Thank you.